Okay, so let's get started. Please join us in welcoming Professor Sylvia Hay. She will talk to us on the topic on transit-oriented development and residential location in Hong Kong from economic and socio-spatial perspectives. So before this talk, I was just chatting with Sylvia. Sylvia is quite an accomplished researcher. She did a PhD from University of Southern California. And currently she is associated with the Department of Geography and Resource Management at the Chinese University of Hong Kong as an associate professor. And I was also talking to her, and she's quite into grant writing, and of course, there are many publications to her credit. Currently, she's the associate editor of Travel Behavior and Society, also of Asian Transport Studies, and she also guest edited several issues at Town Planning Review. At CUHK, she also has taken up many administrative roles. Her research interests, as the topic says, include travel behavior and into transport planning and policy, transport geography, urban and regional studies. Her research is both funded by local as well as government agencies, both international and also regional. So I think there are many grants she has already received from the general research from Hong Kong, from the public policy research funding, government of Hong Kong, and many other sources. Her publications appeared in many international journals of repute, for example, Urban Studies, Journal of American Planning Association, Town Planning Review, and all editions of TRA, Transportation Part A, C, D, and F. So without much delay, let's join hands to welcome Sylvia. Sylvia, the floor is yours. So as Sylvia mentioned, she will first make her presentation, and then she will take up the question and answers. So if you have any questions to follow our presentation, please put them in your chat window, and we'll take them as soon as she finishes her talk. Yeah, so it's all up to you, Sylvia. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Deputy Roy. And thank you all for joining today's seminar. And I will maybe pull out my PowerPoint first, and then try to share the screen. Can you see it, Deputy?
It is visible, Sylvia. It is visible.
Okay, thank you. So I'm associate professor from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And I have a background in geography, in urban planning, and also in economics. So that's why today I'm very honored and delighted to share my research with you all about transit-oriented development in Hong Kong from economic and socio-spatial perspectives. So today's agenda, I will first talk about transit-oriented development, and then to explain the key features of this TOD and why it's so highly praised by transport planners and engineers around the world. And then I will move on to the case in Hong Kong. And the main urban transport network in Hong Kong is called the Mass Transit Railway, or short for MTR. And so this railway is actually, the system is one of the most profitable subways in the world. And the reason behind that, is its operation and business model. It's called a Rail Plus Property, or R plus P models. So with that, I will give a brief example of the case called the Low Cost Park in Hong Kong to show you how this Rail Plus Property model actually works in reality. And with that foundation, I will move on to two recent publications. One is in Transportation Research Part A. In this paper, I estimate how much homeowners are actually willing to pay to get access to rail network accessibility. And in this paper, I take more a regional perspective to see whether there's some spatial heterogeneity across Hong Kong. And in the second paper, that is in published in Town Planning Review in 2018, And in this paper, I more focus on the relationship between mass transit railway, MTR, and its impact to neighborhood changes, and with a focus on the low-income household. So whether MTR development will actually price out low-income household. So if that is the case, what kind of policy implication we can get? So in these two papers, I actually have both economic and socio-spatial perspectives. But to better differentiate these two papers, so I kind of call the first one more focused on the economic perspective, whereas the second one more on the socio-spatial perspective. Okay, so for transit-oriented development, or called TOD, I guess most participants today have heard about it. It is often associated with strong features of the urban form and land use. For example, from Severo and Curtis' publication, it called TOD, features of the TODs are walkable, compact, mixed-use neighborhood with good transit connectivity. And then Professor Robert Severo, who used to work in UC Berkeley, also have written a lot of papers about TOD in the world cities. And in one paper, he reviewed that Hong Kong is one of these main world cities with a strong TOD development among Copenhagen, Stockholm, Curitiba, and Singapore. And why Hong Kong's MTR's system so successful? And it's because the real plus P model that I will explain briefly. So with this model, it actually helped MTR to have sustainable revenue and captive ridership. However, with this development mode, this land value in surrounding area will be driven up. So whether this will create more social issue also deserve our consideration. For example, one previous study implied that the land value appreciation near the MTR development area may potentially encourage more private rather than public residential development. So in this presentation, I will try to have a better understanding in the situation of Hong Kong. So first, I don't know how many of you have been to Hong Kong, and if you have not been to, more than happy to show you briefly the geography in Hong Kong. So this is the image I captured from Google Earth. From this picture, you can see that Hong Kong, the large territory of the land, is actually mountain area or country park. So the development or the built-up area in Hong Kong is actually only a small percentage. So that explains why Hong Kong's population density and built-up density is very high. And that actually makes Hong Kong quite comparable to many Indian cities, because in Indian cities and regions, the population density is also very high. So in the future, if Indian cities and regions decided to have transit-oriented development to accommodate the transport, the travel demand in the urban area, so whether the TOD development should have some caution. So I guess that would be some take-home points from today's presentation based in the case of Hong Kong. And move on to a more abstract map, that is the map of the MTR network or the rail network in Hong Kong, color differently. And so to make the following presentation easier to understand for most of you, I will also briefly tell you about different lines and also the different geographies in Hong Kong. So the first electrified MTR line in Hong Kong is called the Kwun Tong line. It started in 1979, and Kwun Tong is actually one station here. I'll try to use the annotate. All right, so so the Kwun Tong is actually also a station's name in here. And then 3 years later, we have this Israel line. So connecting Hong Kong all the way to the border of mainland China through Shenzhen. So for example, if I would like to go back to my hometown in Guangzhou, China, I will take the East Rail Line and then get off in Luowu, cross the border checkpoint, and then take the intercity rail to my hometown, Guangzhou. So this is the heavy rail line, right, connecting Hong Kong to mainland China. And in the same year, we also have another line that is the Chunwan line, color in red, that connects us Central all the way to Chunwan New Town. So Central here, it is the core of the CBD. And roughly speaking, the CBD in Hong Kong covers several MTR stations, roughly from Sheung Wan, Central, MOT, Wan Chai, and sometimes also include Causeway Bay. So this is called the CBD of Hong Kong, and also have a lot of jobs and office buildings. And in 1985, the Island Line that connects from the west to east of the Hong Kong Island is built. And the next major line in Hong Kong is the Tung Chung Line, opened in 1998. The Tung Chung Line connects Hong Kong, the CBD, through Hong Kong Station, all the way to Tung Chung New Town. And at the same time, we will see that the dark green line is called the Airport Express, have a heavy overlap with the Tung Chung Line. The only two stations that the Tung Chung Line did not cover is the airport stop, airport station, and also the Asia World Expo, these two lines. So for those who would like to take an international flight out of Hong Kong, they can check in their luggage through the Hong Kong station, and then they can go shopping and have a day tour and then go to the airport later that day. And next to the Hong Kong Airport Express line, we also have this very short pink line. So that is the line connecting to Disneyland. So that's why we call it Disney line. And this is the only very one-stop line. So if for visitors who would like to go to Disneyland, they usually take this pink line. And in 2000, we have several new lines open that connect Hong Kong's urban area with new towns. One of them is the Tseung Kwan O line that connects Hong Kong Island to the Tseung Kwan O New Town. So, and in Tseung Kwan O New Town, there's a development area called Low House Park. And I will talk about this case briefly in a few seconds. And in 2003, we have this West Rail open, connecting Hong Kong all the way to the northwest part of Hong Kong. So in this West Rail line, it actually connects several new towns, include Tsuen Wan, Yuen Long, Tin Shui Wai, and all the way to Tuen Mun. And in this part of Hong Kong, you see that this is a small network with a thinner line in yellow color. That's actually the light rail, mainly serving the northwestern part of Hong Kong. So the people from that part can also go to the urban area through the West Rail line. And lastly, we have this Ma On Shan line open in 2004. So that actually connect the urban area to Ma On Shan New Town. And indeed, a lot of university colleagues live in this Ma On Shan New Town, including myself. So those are the main rail network considered in the first paper. And later in 2016, we also have several new lines, but it's not considered in the first paper. So the MTR network, or this corporation, is very successful due to the rail plus property model. And in this model, we can see that there are three main parties in this triangle relationship. So the land in Hong Kong, most of them belongs to Hong Kong government. But Hong Kong government does not build the railway by itself. It actually asks MTR Corporation to build it for the government. So they give the land development right to MTR. So MTR will in return plan, construct, operate, and also maintain the rail lines for the Hong Kong government. So with this land development right, the MTR can actually call for open tender, call for these developers in Hong Kong to co-develop the piece of land surrounding the MTR station. And when the winning developer win the bid, they will have to pay usually a very large lump sum land price or land premium to the Hong Kong government. And when the project is sold, it will share the profit with MTR and sometimes include some office space to the MTR as well. So you can see from this figure, the three parties, Hong Kong government, MTR, and developers, seems to have a win-win relationship. So that explains why the Hong Kong MTR system is still very financially viable compared to many other metro systems in the world, which need the government's heavy subsidy. And from the MTR's website, it's quite easy to find that actually there are a lot of properties either owned, developed, or managed by the corporation. So on the left panel, you see several residential development properties, but this is just a few of the examples. And then on the right hand, we see a lot of shopping malls. Some of them are the regional luxury malls, and some of them are serving local neighborhoods. And of course, there are also some office buildings, either owned or developed or managed by MTR. So the example I'd like to show you, it is called the Logistic Park in the East Park next to the Cheung Kwan O New Town. So this is quite an interesting case study to show how this real plus P model works. So in the left hand, we can see this is the Logistic Park master plan, so to speak. And in the center of this plot of land, that is the Logistic Park station. And the whole piece of land is actually landfilled close to Cheung Kwan O New Town. And when the MTR have this piece of land from the government, and so it will divide this piece of land into different phases. And this piece of land in Logistic Park the planning started in 2002. And even these days, is still some of these lands are still being developed. For example, the phase 8, later we'll see the picture, that is the latest project sold in the market. And close to phase 7, later we will have this shopping mall built by the MTR. So that will make the whole area, the neighborhood here, becomes very integrated. So we'll have a school, have shopping mall, have a lot of retail, restaurant, etc. So that is the benefit of the TOD model. It helps densify the area and create a very active and dynamic community. So this is the latest development. That is what is shown in the phase 8 around here. That is the latest development. Became on sale since last month and still on the market. And I declare I have no conflict of interest or connection with this developer, but I think it's just the latest development project I'd like to share with you. So it is in Chinese, but I briefly translated into English so you can understand and get some latest information about the property market in Hong Kong. So what it shows you here, it is for example, the total number of units is about 1,400. And then on the first price list, about 300 units on sale. And the average unit price is about 16,000 Hong Kong dollars per square foot. So you can see this is a Hong Kong standard. It's very expensive compared to many world cities. And the next one, it is the average size of this unit ranges from 400 square feet to about 1,100 square feet. And you may also feel this is a relatively small in international standard. This is because the land price in Hong Kong is very expensive. So for this, in order to get a unit, even the smallest unit in this project, you have to pay more than 6 million Hong Kong dollars. And the most expensive one will cost you 18 million Hong Kong dollars. And so this is critical day, that is the earliest day you can move into this unit. So that is February 2022. So this project is a pre-sale, which is quite common in Hong Kong. And the last one, you can see the developers here, including two parties. One is Cheung Kong Property. It's owned by one of the richest men in Hong Kong, Mr. Li Ka-shing and family. And the other one is the MTR. So you can see that this is how the real plus P the property model works. So in the development stage, usually one of the leading developers in Hong Kong will join MTR as developers and then co-develop this piece of land.
So Sylvia, a quick question.
Right.
One participant, Professor Mohan Turaga, he asked, like, what is the ownership structure of MTR? Would you know that?
The MTR actually in 2000, it went on IPO already. So about, I think, 70% of this MTR is like public shareholding. And then the government still hold quite a significant amount of the share. So the government has a lot of control in the MTR corporation. But at the same time, the MTR has its own management and the board member. So this is kind of the structure in the MTR corporation.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so with that, I will start to talk about the two papers on of my recent publication. The first one, what I try to estimate is how much homeowners are willing to pay for the real network accessibility. So this is actually quite a crowded literature, and a lot of researchers have studied this land price capitalization. So what I find in the previous study is that a lot of researchers measure the accessibility as a binary relation. So whether this MTR is within 500 meters of the house. So if yes, the dummy variable will have a value of 1, but if no, then this dummy variable will be 0. So what I argue in this paper is that a regional accessibility would be more appropriate to reflect the willingness to pay for the accessibility. So I illustrate this relationship in this simple figure. So this is a line with a 4 station. And let's say the catchment area is 500. So within 500 meters, that we'll consider as catchment area. And then later, if we have an extension and then the station B is open, and in future, probably another new line, like the blue line is open with 2 new stations, C and D. So if we consider the old way of thinking, a local accessibility, then the house in here next to station A would not be able to consider as a beneficiary of the new line or new stations of B, C, and D because it's not within 500 meters of this catchment area of these new stations. And but if you think more carefully, if you are homeowners of this property, do you think you would enjoy the opening of new station and the new lines of BCD? Probably is yes, because with these new stations, although it's not in the proximity of your house, still will take you far away to other places of the region. So that's why I argue that our regional accessibility may be more appropriate to reflect the impact of a new transport infrastructure. So for this accessibility measurement is a simple gravity-based measure first proposed by Hansen in 1959. And later, a lot of researchers adopted this measurement. For example, in 2012, my former advisor, Professor Jan Giuliano, published a paper using this measurement. And the input of this measurement is the shortest travel time between any 2 locations within the region. So in the case of highway accessibility, then the shortest time would be between through the highway accessibility, through the highway network. And then when we apply this measure in the case of Hong Kong in MTR network, we need to do some small modification. Is because usually when we go from home to the nearest MTR station, there involves a short walking distance. And then when we get off the MTR station and then reach our final destination, that may also involve a short walking distance. That's what we call the access and egress time. So in total, the TIJ consists of access time, in-vehicle time, and egress time. And in this paper, I pull out the 2001 and 2011 data. And then I hypothesize that homeowners in Hong Kong are willing to pay a price for that because the MTR is considered the backbone of Hong Kong's transport system. And about 30% of the home-based work trip are undertaken in MTR on a daily basis. So if you're living close to MTR or have easy access, then it will help you to reduce a lot of commute time. At the same time, I would like to test whether there's a significant regional heterogeneity in this willingness to pay. So in this first set of model, I have a cross-sectional model for the 2001 and 2011 data. So the left-hand side is the price of a property in its log form. And the right-hand side, we have the set of housing structure variable H. A is the MTR accessibility. We have the N is the neighborhood variables, and L is the location variables. And so the second set of the model, we have the difference in difference approach. That is where I pull out this observation that are transacted in both 2001 and 2011. So in this case, we can actually cancel out the housing structure variables and location variables in equation 4 because those two type of variables are usually fixed over time. And more importantly, with the D&D approach, we can also cancel out the unobserved variables that are potentially affecting the price. So in this case, we have this very simple equation 4 that measures the price ratio in its log form is as a function of the change in accessibility and the change in neighborhood variables. And so in terms of the estimation, instead of using OLS, I use this multi-level model. And in a paper published in 2017, I briefly review why housing price model would not be appropriate to be estimated in OLS because they're usually spatially autocorrelated instead of being independent from each other. And so that's why I use a hierarchical estimation. And in this model, this hierarchical estimation would allow this error term of each house variable to be able to correlate it within some predefined boundaries, such as a neighborhood and also submarket. And so in this paper, I also allowed this random variable, random coefficient of the willingness to pay to be able to vary across the boundaries, such as the submarket, because we assume the homeowners will have their self-selection in different submarkets. So that's why the homeowners in different submarkets may have different willingness to pay. So at the end, we have this three-level multi-level estimation. And so here's the map of Hong Kong, and just to recap, Hong Kong Island and Kowloon here we consider as an urban area. And then the rest, the majority of Hong Kong is the new territories, or short for NT. And some of these areas is the suburban NT. Those are the new towns. And the other one are the rural area, including country parks. So this map also shows you that in the line in black are the real lines built before 2001. And the line in blue are the ones that are extended between 2001 and 2011. So we would like to estimate how much these new lines will create the change in the land price. So here's some maps showing the land price on top of the network accessibility. So what we see in both years, the urban properties are actually more expensive compared to the suburban properties. That is actually quite makes sense because a lot of jobs are located in the urban area. So if you live in the urban area in Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, you can reduce a lot of commute time. And in the first set of the model, we have these cross-sectional results. So what we see here is the house structure variables. Most of them are significant. And then the MTR accessibility is also significant. with elasticity about 0.35 in 2001 and 0.47 in 2011. So that means about 10% increase in MTR accessibility will lead to 4.7 increase in the housing price. And then we have a bunch of neighborhood level variables. And then the only variables that are consistently significant in both years is the number of top primary schools in the school district. That means that homeowners in Hong Kong very care about the school quality, especially the top schools. And lastly, we have this number of location variables. And in 2011, we see this suburban coefficient is also significant, meaning that the suburban properties are priced at discount. And then we move on to the D&D approach with this repeat sales data. So in this model, we see that it's a very simple form. What we see, the significant result is the change in MTR accessibility is significant, whereas the change in the neighborhood variables are not significant. So if we map out this elasticity across different submarkets, we will see that different submarkets, their elasticities are actually quite different. So the one in very dark red color are those with the highest level of elasticity. That means these neighborhoods, homeowners are most willingness to pay for the increase in the MTR accessibility. So where are those new towns? This actually Tuen Mun, Yuen Long, Ma On Shan, and Tseung Kwan O. So those are the new towns that are directly affected by the new stations and new lines that are open between 2001 and 2011. And another interesting point is some of this neighborhood in Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, those are not directly affected by the new station. However, their elasticity is still above average level. That actually confirms what we mentioned at the beginning is these new MTR stations will have a regional impact rather than just local. So if we have a simple scatter plot, and we will see that the elasticity is actually in a very linear fashion compared to the change in MTR accessibility. That means in several new towns on the upper right-hand side, homeowners are willing to pay more to get these properties. So to conclude and withdraw, to draw some policy implications from the first paper, we see that the MTR will have regional accessibility, and at the same time, it will affect the land premium, the whole region. So this paper have some contribution to the literature. The first one is we focus on regional assets rather than proximity. So we use this gravity-based accessibility measure rather than a dummy variable or binary measure to measure proximity. The second one is we set up a model such that we can allow these homeowners willing to pay to vary across different submarkets. And in that case, we are able to review that homeowners in several new towns that are directly affected by the new rail lines have a strongest capitalization effect. So in terms of policy, we will consider housing affordability is one issue because we see that affordability and land price appreciation is no longer just an issue in the MTR precinct, but also in the whole region. The second one is about land value capture policy. And in some regions, government and the policymakers start to talk about whether we should ask landowners along the transit corridor to pay for the construction or even maintenance of this transport infrastructure because their land value appreciates. So in this paper, we review that this land appreciation is actually a whole region rather than just along the transit corridor. So whether we should revise the land value capture policy to reflect such regional impact, I think it deserves further consideration. So with that, I will quickly move to the second paper, that is to review the impact of MTR network expansion on the the neighborhood changes, especially focusing on the low-income households' location choice, and then to understand whether they have been priced out from this prime location or not. And so in this paper, we still use the network accessibility as one key measurement of the impact of MTR network expansion. But we take on a longer time horizon. So the first is the network accessibility in 1979, when we first have the Kunton line. And the right-hand side, we have the 2016 with two latest extensions, the South Island line and Kunton line extension. So as you can see in this comparison, with the MTR network extended over the years, the landscape of the accessibility also changed a lot. So in the literature, plenty of research have revealed that the MTR or the transport infrastructure can stimulate local economic development at land price. And some researchers, especially those with sociology background or urban studies or urban geography background, they may be more concerned about gentrification, whether this transit-induced gentrification would be happening in precinct area. So some people call it spatial injustice. And so in this second paper, I will try to review whether such a gentrification or spatial injustice also exists in Hong Kong. So to trace the low-income group, I take the spatial unit of public housing estates. Because in Hong Kong, the lower income group tend to live in public housing estates, and then the higher income group tend to live in private housing estates. As you can see, the median household income between those two groups are very different. So the main research question I like to answer is whether the location of public and private housing have changed as a result of the MTR network expansion. So to pull out this information, I go to the government's census website. So in that website, we can get the major housing estates information. So what is a major housing estate? That is defined by an estate with at least 1,000 households or 3,000 residents. So in a sense, you can consider it's a limitation of this paper is that we do not have all the housing estates in Hong Kong, rather the major housing estates. And from this map, you can see there's a strong co-location between the housing estates and the MTR network. That reflects that Hong Kong's TOD development model is very highly penetrating in different neighborhoods. All right, so to further examine, we do a very simple visualization that is called the trend plot. So what we did is to do a 500 buffer around each stations. And then we can count how many housing estates units are public and how many housing estate units are private, and then take the difference called the DN. And so because each line have a different number of stations, so to normalize this effect, we will divide the DN with the number of stations of each line so that we get to the DN prime. In other words, the DN prime would indicate whether there are more public housing estates along that line or not. So if DN prime is positive, that means there are more public housing estates along the MTR line. So in this figure, we see that this over different period, the DN prime is quite different. For example, in the 1970s, we only have the Kunton line. And in that period, the DN prime is mostly positive. So along that line, we see a lot more public housing estates. And then in the 1980s, we have several lines open. However, we see a very balance between public and private estates. That's why the lines is not particularly towards positive or negative. And in the 90s, we only have the Tung Chung line, and that is open in 1998. And we see that a few years after the opening of the Tung Chung line, we see this pre-DN prime is very negative. That means a lot of private estates opening since the Tung Chung line is open. And in the 2000 and afterwards, we also have several new lines open. But here we see a very mixed picture. So to investigate the situation more closely, we do a logistic regression. So basically, we want to estimate whether the housing estate that is open is private or public. So if it's a private, it's a 1, and if a public, it's takes as a 0. So we run 2 sets of models. The first set of model is models 1 to 4. That consider the housing estates open between 1984 to 2011, and with about 600 observations. And then the second set of model is models 5 to 8. So those are the housing estates open in newer, so between 1995 to 2011, with a smaller number of observations, about 280. But the good thing about the model 5 to 8 is, while focusing on newer period, we're able to get in the neighborhood variables into the explanatory variable from the census. So equation 3 summarize what we put in the model. So the left-hand side, we predict whether the housing estate is private or not. And then on the right-hand side, we have this A, that is MTR accessibility. The change in A is this delta A is a change in MTR accessibility. And S is whether there's an MTR station that is open before or after a certain years since the opening of the housing estates. And T is a set of time dummy, and X is the neighborhood variables. But X is only available in the second set of variables, second set of models, model 5 to 8. So we can see now is the result from the first set of models 1 to 4. And first we see these time dummy variables. And between 1989 to 2001, these housing estates are quite likely to be public compared to the reference period, 1984 to 1988. And for the accessibility coefficient is actually negative. That shows that in this period, and the neighborhoods with better accessibility associated with public housing. And the next one is probably more interesting. It is whether there's a station opens 3 years or 5 years before the opening of the housing estate. So this we see that several of them are positive. For example, station opens 3 years before the housing estate, or station 5 years open the housing estate. That means if a station is open, then within 3 years and 5 years, they are likely to attract a private development in the precinct. And related to that, we also see the cumulative accessibility. So the cumulative accessibility 5 years before is also positive. That means if a neighborhood's accessibility improved, then 5 years later, we are likely to see a private development in that neighborhood. That actually shows some proof of a hypothesis. And lastly, we see this location dummy, that is the private estates are more likely to be built in the suburban area or new territories. And then in the second set of model, we have a newer period, 1995 to 2011. And so in this period variable, we have the neighborhood variable, population density, and high income household. So the high income household of the neighborhood is positive. That is actually makes sense because we know that the private housing usually serve the high income groups. So if a neighborhood have more high income households, that actually attract private development. And then for the time dummy, we see that in 1998 to 2008, then we have more private housing open compared to the reference period, which is 1995 to 1997. And then we see the accessibility variables are no longer significant. That means in this newer period, then neighborhoods with better accessibilities are no longer affiliated with public housing. And also for station, this set of variables not significant anymore. But still for accessibility, the change in accessibility 5 years before the opening of housing estate is still significant. That means if a neighborhood have improved accessibility, then 5 years later, or within 5 years, we are likely to see a private development in that neighborhood. All right. So lastly, the location variables also are not very significant. So to conclude from the second study, we see that from our estimation, we can get the answer whether private housing estate occupy more prime location in the MTR network. So the answer for this is kind of a no and yes. The no is that from the first set of model, the accessibility variable is actually negative, meaning that the neighborhoods with better accessibility are affiliated with public housing. However, the answer can be also yes. It's because from the variable S and delta A. So when a new station is open and when the neighborhood's MTR accessibility improves, then within 3 years or 5 years, it's likely to have a private estate in that neighborhood. That actually implies there's some speculation in private developers. So they can actually get the land where the MTR is supposed to open so that they can schedule the building and opening of that estate to be on market and then to get this premium. And so the take-home lesson from this empirical study is how shall we as urban planners or policymakers prevent public housing development from being outbid or being priced out in the prime locations. So one recommendation is that we may need to reserve sufficient land for public housing development and then into the MTR expansion land. In other words, in this private-led residential development model, the government may need to have certain level of intervention so that the land in this prime location will not be 100% or majorly taken up by private development. So after all, we see that the MTR is not just a transit operator in Hong Kong, but also an estate developer, as we have shown in this Real Plus property model at the beginning. So we urge the MTR should strike a balance between efficiency and equity as a whole. So with that, I thank you all for your attention, and I acknowledge the support from my faculty of social science for funding the project. And then the references of these two papers I just presented can be also found on the website. So I guess if you have any questions, Debjit will help moderate, and I'm happy to answer.
First of all, thank you, Prof Sylvia, for the wonderful talk. It was quite engaging in terms of your thought here. I already see a few questions that has come through from our audience. One question is from Abhishek. He asked, like, what is the major financing source for the construction of transport infrastructure? And there are many other parts, but maybe we'll take one by one. The other part is the financing taken care by urban local bodies or projects depend on the state and central grants?
So the first one is about the financial source, right?
Yes, for the construction of transport infrastructure. And the second part of the first question is the financing taken care by urban local bodies or projects depending on the state or central grants?
So I guess I will answer the first question first. So the transport infrastructure in Hong Kong, a lot of them are still financed by the government. So for example, the highway, we have the highway development. So that will be financed by the government. But sometimes some infrastructure actually is a public and private partnership. So the government can invite the public, the private partner to build it. For example, several of these cross-harbor tunnels in Hong Kong, initially they may invite the private party to help construct it. And then it will give them a certain period of lease, for example, 30 years. so that the profit and also the price can be managed by the private parties. And then after the lease, the ending of the lease, the government can get back this the control. So this is quite well known as the build and operate and transfer model. And then in terms of the railway, and the MTR actually have the control from the government to finance the railway. So in Hong Kong, actually the government does not need to subsidize the railway construction as the case in many other world cities, because from this railway development with this TOD model in Hong Kong, then the MTR can actually get this profit share from the development. And then it can also make an investment through a lot of properties. For example, the residential, shopping mall, and also from this office building. And of course, it can also get some income from the transit fare price, although it's not very expensive compared to many world cities. So that is how this Hong Kong's MTR development can finance itself, so without the government subsidy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sylvia. There's a second part of the question, which is how successful can tax increment financing be as an option to finance TOD? And does supplementing it with municipal bonds makes it more viable?
I think this one is, the Hong Kong is actually does not really issue any bond for the MTR. I think for the bond as a funding model, usually is needed in the case where the municipal government is short of funding. Then it will need to issue the bond to get public support in financing the project. However, in the case of Hong Kong, because the MTR is quite cash resourceful, so it does not have to issue the bond to get the public money to finance its project.
Okay. I think maybe, yeah, there are a few other who wants to ask a question. So maybe you can ask the audience if they really want to directly ask you the questions. They can maybe talk to you directly. Yeah, Mohan, you want to do that? Or anybody else who had questions? Sandeep, anybody else who want to have directly questions? If not, I have one question in terms of the impacts, Sylvia, which is more about, I think from both the studies, I see you partner a lot with the MTR in terms of finding out how does the prices vary and all the other things, you know. So did you also give some of your output to the MTR or discuss with them so that where they can start the next station or how they should extend their lines? So did you all also have some kind of discussions post your studies?
I think it's a very good suggestion, and I think I should have done that. Unfortunately, I have not. But before the town planning review paper, before I investigated the relationship between MTR and neighborhood changes, we actually had an interview with a planner, a senior planner in the MTR corporation, and also interview with a former planning director in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. So actually we have some diverse voices as well as from some of my colleagues. So from the government's point of view, they always feel they have reserved a lot of land for public housing development. And but for some long-term Hong Kong residents, for example, some of my colleagues kind of feel the private developments taking up more and more prime locations. And so this kind of two contradictory voices kind of motivated me to do this study. Okay. So that's why we make a lot of effort to collect this housing information from various sources as well to see whether we have reserved sufficient land, because to investigate this question, we have to have a clear temporal point. So whether the station comes here first will attract more public and private estates. So this the time stamp affiliated with each line and each station and each house is important. So that is the motivation. And afterwards, after the studies published, we also make some public presentation, but kind of within CUHK or in other campus or in conference. But in terms of like exchanging the view with the MTR, I think that's something I should do more in future.
Sure. Thank you so much. Yes, Mohan, you want to? You're muted. Yeah.
Hi, Sylvia. Thanks for the presentation. It's really interesting. I have a couple of questions. I'm not an expert in this area, but so let me know if it doesn't make sense. On the second paper, you were saying that your results show that the private developers outbid the public housing. But wondering, what about, like, is there because you're only looking at the supply side, right? I mean, is there actually demand for public housing? And how do we know that actually the private players' development is outbidding the public housing? It could also be a result of lack of demand for the public housing, and I don't know how it works in Hong Kong.
Okay, thanks for your questions, and I should clarify. I think it's a very good point to see the demand as well. And the short answer for your question is that the demand for public housing is very high, and so the lower income household need to wait several years to get into public housing, and that's why in Hong Kong, still more than I guess like 100,000 households still live in subdivided housing, and because they have not been able to get in the queue of public housing estates. So and so right now, Hong Kong government is also trying different ways. For example, transition housing. So to build some easy to build structure to accommodate lower income groups a few years, and then the land may later turn into other purposes. But for at least a few years, the lower income families who cannot get the public housing yet can stay in the transition housing for a shorter period. But still, it's better than some household living subdivided housing, or sometimes like they become homeless. So this is the situation in Hong Kong. And so how government can get more land for public housing is like one of the top policy related issue right now here.
Does that answer your question, Mohan?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I actually have one more question, but Sandeep has a related question. Maybe you should answer that before.
Yeah, let me read out Sandeep's question. His question is, while new stations attracted private developers, is there evidence of gentrification or shortage in the supply of affordable units? Could it just be densification and more efficient use of land without any impact on supply of affordable units?
All right, so I try to understand this question.
Sandeep, why don't you come up and
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry. So Sylvia, just a quick, yeah, thanks for your presentation. Just wanted to ask, so your models showed that once a new station is developed, it attracts more private development, right?
Right.
But could you talk a little more about evidence of, a resultant shortage in affordable units in the vicinity? So is there evidence of that as well, or is it that there, there was land available for development or redevelopment, and it just became more, the intensity of development increased, more efficient use of land, or is there evidence of shortage in affordable unit supply?
Okay, so I try to answer your question. Is I think it's also your perspective is quite I think innovative. It's like to take into account the supply of land. So I think surrounding the MTR station, I think the government, of course, can decide whether it will be reserved for public housing or not. So if the piece of land is already reserved for private development, then the MTR will invite private developers to co-develop this piece of land. And but sometimes the government say this piece of land will not for bidding. It may also require the MTR to reserve this piece of land to be mixed development with a certain number of units reserved for lower income household. And in that case, then the lower income household can still have sufficient unit to be surrounding this prime location. And so in terms of the densification, I think it's it will not be such a big impact, because in general, the piece of land in Hong Kong, and particularly around the MTR stations, are also very high level because the land price is very expensive. So I guess the densification level either is developed for public housing or private housing, it will be already very high. So I don't know if I answer your question or not.
No, this is helpful. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, there's one question by Vidhi. So Vidhi, do you want to read out the question? Okay, if not, I'll read out Vidhi's question. She is wondering, how do we control for the other developments and infrastructure that comes up in areas around the new MTR locations and their impact on the land prices?
I'll try to read the question. Can you repeat the question? I cannot locate it.
Yeah, I'm just sending it to you. 1 second. I think it was privately sent, so I'm sending it to everyone. Yeah, this was her question. So how do we control for other developments and infrastructure that comes up in areas around the new MTR locations? And that could be a school or a medical facility or other things.
Okay, I think this one for the other developments. And in such case, it would be a little bit difficult to control, especially, for example, the top schools, for example, that homeowners, especially those with affordability, would like to bid for high quality schools. And so if, for example, if one very good school is located near MTR station, for example, that will also affect the land price. However, in Hong Kong in general, the school quality has been quite stable over the years. So, and also the opening of a new school need to go through the Education Bureau, and it takes some time. So it will not be a huge influx of schools, for example, or other amenities into this neighborhood at the same time. But of course, we cannot exclude this potential impact of other facilities or amenities affecting the house price. So I guess there's something maybe we can take into control in future. For example, in this neighborhood level variables, we may be able to take into account other developments, for example, schools and other amenities people are looking for.
Okay, I hope that answers this question. I think we are also running out of time, I know. Okay, there is one more final question. We'll take this as a final question, maybe.
Sure.
Is the model of increasing land prices with infrastructure development possible only in cities which already have some momentum of growth, or can it be used in blighted areas as well?
Okay. That is a big question. I think it's a bit difficult to say whether to use this model to attract development in blighted area. And because in blighted area, you need to have sufficient attractiveness for developers to go there and develop the area. And but in the case of Hong Kong, in general, when there's a station open, and people will flock into that neighborhood, and so it has this huge economic momentum in revitalizing the area. However, in other cities, I think it's I don't have evidence to say it's a yes or no. So unless I think we have some empirical study, I cannot really say it will work or not. Yeah. Because there are many other factors the developers will consider whether to have this TOD invest a lot of money in that area, because it's also quite risky. The return period could be long. So, yeah.
No, I think thank you, Sylvia, for all the presentation, answering the questions so patiently. I hope sometime you can visit our campus physically, right? So this was
I really wish.
Yeah. So we hope we'll make it happen someday. And yeah, so again, thank you, and thank you all the audience here who have come to listen to Sylvia, and hope yeah, we can be mutually beneficial some other time. Yeah. Thank you again,
so much,
Sylvia, for your kind acceptance for giving this talk. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.